Hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle back with part two of the Hot Mic Show for today, and we're here with our friend Kurt Schlichter, who, as you probably know by now, is a veteran. He's a former trial lawyer. He writes a great deal of tremendous conservative articles all around the place, and was a stand-up comedian, which is kind of what you need to be if you're going to talk about the last 8 years of military policy. Kurt, before we get into the specifics about some of the things that Donald Trump suggested and some of the problems he's going to face with this new plan for Afghanistan, let me just ask you, have you heard anything at all from any friends you might have in the military? Not so much about specifics, needless to say, but did this speech of Donald Trump's put a spring in somebody's step, do you think?
I don't see how it couldn't. He's really, it's an interesting speech. It was like half War College lecture and half Donald Trump's speech. It mixed a lot of military ideas. For instance, when he started talking of national power, diplomatic, military, economic, he left out information. It's the dime paradigm, and then turned into a straight up populism. So it was kind of an interesting mix. Yeah, you can just listening to him, you can tell he was listening to generals, and you can tell he had access to some information maybe he didn't have before, and that changed his mind. I think the abandonment of Iraq in 2011, which led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people at the hands of ISIS, is a mistake he doesn't want to repeat. I think he's listening. He's changing. He admitted, I thought one thing before I came in. I've seen new facts. Now I'm going about that.
Yeah, that's a sign of well, that's just a plain sign of intelligence, number one, and it's a sign of a person whose ego is not so completely run amok that they simply can't be wrong no matter what the consequences are. Kurt, one of the things that I got out of his speech that I thought was very impressive right off the bat was the sense that our strategy there now, our policy rather, is going to be adaptive and it's going to be flexible. In other words, our methods will change as we see the results on the ground. We will look at the situation and react to what we have there and then take the initiative rather than just go in with this kind of preset plan and stick to it forever. Did that sound like the kind of thing you think today's Army wants to hear?
Well, it's so obvious that it's hard to imagine that we had an administration for 8 years that would say the opposite. I mean, obviously you don't hand the enemy a timetable because then all they do is wait. No, he went in and said when it's time to go, then it's time to go, and not before. Um, I was very pleased with that, and that combined with rules of engagement that express some sort of sanity, I think is going to make our troops' morale go up and make us much more effective. I mean, when you have troops who know somebody's a bad guy and they know he's hidden his gun and they can't shoot it until he picks up his gun and shoots at them first. That's just stupid. That's not war. That's playing games. And I think what Donald Trump said is we're not playing games anymore. We're not, taking half measures. He expressed what I think is kind of a Jacksonian theory of war. It's the Jacksonian Americans who tend to do the fighting. So that I think they have a better view of it than some of the, soft boys back in Washington, D.C. and New York who are always ready to fight to the last drop of some kid from Alabama's blood.
Yep.
They understand that if, we're Americans and we're willing to fight, but you got to let us win. And I think that's
this
what
is one of the
Trump's
great
strategy embodies.
Yeah, I think so too. Rules of engagement are just so critically important, and we don't realize, those of us who are not in the military, who've not been overseas in either one of these two theaters, we don't understand how simply just horribly demoralizing that must be. Look, when we're fighting in Afghanistan or with ISIS or so on, we're fighting an enemy that is not wearing uniforms. Now, that may sound like not a big deal, but it's a very big deal. People, combatants, soldiers, wear uniforms to protect the civilians. In other words, this is a person who's an enemy soldier, a combatant. You can shoot at him. If he's not wearing a uniform, then you can't shoot at them because they're civilians. These are people that hide behind civilians. These are people that use their own people as human shields. And to have an 18-year-old young man sitting there and have to deal with all of the adrenaline of combat, all of the reflexes and the quickness and the alertness and everything that he needs, and then to have that process hang in his mind because he has to go through the stage of what will the lawyers say about this, what will be the legal repercussions of this split-second action I'm going to have to take. That makes life virtually impossible in combat in a situation like this.
No, it makes it very, very difficult because you hesitate. And are we over there to win, or are we over there not to win? Because winning requires taking actions consistent with victory. And that means killing the enemy. And when you kill the enemy, you're going to hurt other people. And that's just the way it is. Instead of pulling our hair out every time we hear we bombed a wedding party, which is always baloney. But every time we bomb a wedding party, I think we ought to say, maybe next time you don't go party with Al Qaeda guys. If you go to their wedding, you're probably going to die because you're near them. Everyone around them's going to die. Perhaps you should govern your life accordingly, because we're not going to stop. You don't get a veto over victory. We're going to find them and kill them. If you're stupid enough to be around them, you're probably going to have a problem. And this is consistent with the law of war. There are ways to fight a war in that manner. Tradition.
Well, we watched in Vietnam this idea that we don't want to use excessive force against people that are killing our guys all the time. So we're just gonna continually stay our hand. We're gonna stop bombing, then we'll restart bombing. We're not gonna cross this line. We're not gonna do this. We're not gonna do that. All of this nonsense. Can't touch these harbors and so on. And so the conflict drags out for, what was it, 11 years of American involvement, and the amount of suffering goes up astronomically. It would have been a great deal of suffering if it was sharp and quick, but then it would have been over. It wouldn't have been an 11-year-old bleeding wound that simply would not heal, and the agony goes on and on and on and on and on. You got to put an end to this, and that means you have to fight as fiercely as possible and get this position, this win, down so that the people on the ground over there understand it. And then not only do they get to live without the Taliban, I'm sure they'd get a fair amount of U.S. assistance as well.
Let me tell you quickly about two famous American flag officers. The first is General Sherman. And what General Sherman did is he marched through Georgia and he destroyed everything. He wiped out their bread. He had to do, and that gutted the Confederacy. And then the war stopped. The bloodletting stopped. Bloodletting we have never seen in the history of our nation, hopefully never will again. But he stopped it. And he said, war is hell. And you can't change that. There's another flag officer I had the honor of talking to, Admiral Stockdale. You might remember him. He was Ross Perot's running mate. In one of the things that made me hate the media, they tried to turn him into a joke. Interviewing this Medal of Honor winner for his heroism as a prisoner of war at his home in Coronado in the late 80s when I was a college student. And he told me how they were being tortured. They were being beaten up until Christmas 1972, when President Nixon unleashed the B-52s on Haiphong and Hanoi. And one day, everything exploded. And the rumble and the noise of American firepower was incredible. And you know what? The Vietnamese stopped torturing them because they knew it was done. They knew we weren't playing anymore.
Yeah.
If it ain't worth winning, it ain't worth fighting. Don't ask somebody to die for a half measure because you don't have the stones to do what's got to be done. If you're not going to do it, don't do it. Period.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly right. And I think anybody who's ever put themselves in harm's way, or anybody who's even read any fundamental history of warfare and conflict, knows that this is exactly correct. That this netherworld that we've come to live in the last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st, this state of war but non-war, this kind of, what is the word? It's some kind of response. It's a not conditional response. It's
proportional.
Oh, what's the word? In any event, that's it. Thank you. Proportional response. The idea that they do something small, so we have to do something small. They do something medium-sized, we have to respond with something medium-sized. If they do something small and we decide it's worth fighting for, then we give them everything we've got, and the situation ends pretty quickly after that. Kurt, one of the things that I think most people were surprised and pleased to see was the inclusion of Pakistan into this equation. Terrorists need havens. Our problem for the last 16 years since September 11th, our problem has never been killing these guys. Our problem has never been destroying the enemy, ever. That's always been actually really relatively simple. The problem is finding them. That's the problem, is finding them and finding people who hide among civilian populations. And many times we have found them. We know where they are, but we can't attack them because they're in the middle of a school or something like that. But Pakistan, on some level, has served as sort of this upper-level safe haven, hasn't it? It gives the Taliban access to supplies. It gives them essentially a line that they can run behind. It's almost like Smokey and the Bandit. You know, you get across the line to Pakistan and the sheriff has to stop. That's going to stop, I suspect, now.
I certainly hope so. Pakistan has been playing both sides against the middle for decades. They are absolutely allowing the enemy to use their territory to kill Americans. And it's got to stop. And we've got to stop playing around. You know, I think for the last 8 years, America has not been feared. America's been laughed at. America's been a punchline. And I think one of the reasons foreigners don't like Donald Trump is because he's unabashedly pro-American. He takes our side. He's going to do things consistent with victory. Yeah, hard to believe.
Yeah, imagine the president who takes our side and doesn't lecture us on why we're not sufficiently sophisticated enough to understand why these people are cutting our throats. Quick question, Kirk, because we're almost out of time. So very quick answer here. We've been at war basically since 2001, and I mean real war, shooting war in Afghanistan. It started in October. It's 16 years now. Donald Trump has just called for some more action and an increase in the number of troops committed. Do you think the American people will take it?
I think if we start doing what we did with ISIS, you know, people had a lot of concern. Then it became, and I think as long as we're winning, as long as the president's delivering the victory we're capable of, even though our military is broken and exhausted and off point, as this unfortunate second collision may show, the American people are going to support us. Remember, Americans are always supporting their military. They're not mad because the military's fighting. They're mad because they believe our troops are being let down.
Yeah, and sacrificed for ideology. Kurt, thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure. Your articles are just outstanding, and you're always a great guy to talk to. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So that's the question, ladies and gentlemen. Will the American people put up with it? Will they put up with more promises of escalating a war in Afghanistan that's been going on for 16 years, 8 of which certainly no major effort was made to win? I would have said no, except that there's something about those 16 years, and that something about those 16 years is something I talked about at the beginning of the show. 179 attacks, 1,275 killed, 932 injured, 37 suicide blasts in 25 countries for July of this year. July, 1 month. The enemy is out there, and they keep showing us that they're out there, and they keep doing things to remind us all the time that they're out there. And as long as these attacks go on in places like London and Brussels and so on, there's going to be support from the American people to put an end to this. I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us on Hot Mic, and we will see you here tomorrow right here on NRATV.